Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight for Japanese Craft Beer Lecture and Tasting 2019. After the talk, we invite you to join us in the lobby for a Japanese craft beer tasting reception featuring more than 20 varieties of Japanese craft beer. I'm pleased to introduce our speaker for tonight, Ms. Anne Becerra. Ms. Becerra was the first female certified Cicerone in New York City and has been at the helm of some of the best craft beer bars in Manhattan before finding her current home as beverage director for Treadwell Park's multiple locations. She has written for Serious Eats and Martha Stewart's Living, as well as being featured in the New York Times, CNN, Time Magazine, GQ, NBC, the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, and countless others. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Becerra to the stage.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all so much for having me. And thank you to the Japan Society. If I'm being honest, I was a little surprised when I first got that call from the Japan Society. I'm not an expert in Japanese culture, but once we started speaking, it's such a great organization. And I realized that they wanted tonight to be a little bit more about New York beer scene in New York and in the United States, and sort of the trends that we're seeing around the world, and how I think Japanese craft beer is going to really be able to fit into the US beer scene. So that got me really excited. And so thank you again. Please don't judge my, there we go, okay. Okay, if I mess up on this, we'll just pretend like it didn't happen. So my name is Anne Becerra. I've been working in the craft beer industry officially for just a little over 10 years. And it's just such an exciting time to be in this industry because right now we have more options than we've ever had. There are more craft breweries in the United States than have ever been. And it's not just craft breweries, it's more bars and restaurants with great beer menus and bottle shops and just kind of a little bit of everything. And so in terms of variety and in terms of, ubiquity and quality, the US right now is pretty on top of our game. You're seeing a lot of our American styles being replicated all over the world, in Denmark and in Sri Lanka and kind of all over, but it really hasn't always been that way. It's still kind of a new thing, and it wasn't that long ago that we were in the same position that a lot of Japanese craft brewers are just a few years ago. So I kind of wanted to give just a little bit of backstory and a little context on how we got here, because I really do see a lot of parallels between the early American craft brewing days and the early Japanese craft brewing days. And I think that, context is really important. And one thing that the two cultures certainly have in common is the ability to take inspiration from somewhere else and kind of adapt it to our own needs, our own tastes, and make it our own. As Americans, this is a melting pot, right? So that really shows through our culinary identity and, of course, our beers. And if you look back, to, let's say, the 1870s and the 1800s, we had over 3,000 breweries in the United States. And a little bit later, maybe 1890s, there were 48 breweries in Brooklyn alone. So if you follow the immigration patterns, we started with the English ales and kind of moved into the German lagers. And once those German lagers hit, the crisp, clean, golden pilsners, game over. Everyone really just kind of fell in love with it, and it very quickly took over, not just in the US, but around the world. However, our agriculture in the US is very different than in Europe, and we had a different kind of barley. We had corn, we had rice, we had these other adjuncts. And so the all-malt German classic style of Pilsner ended up sort of morphing into what's now known as the American lager or the adjunct lager. Still actually one of the most popular style in the world. I believe it's something like 90 to 95% of beer sold in the world is of that adjunct lager style, so pretty big. So let's see, new preference here and around the world. But right around that time, we were getting all of these technological advances. So in addition to these, new German Pilsners hitting America, we had transportation, we had railroads, we had refrigeration, bottling lines, things that, a higher understanding of pasteurization. And so I'd say quickly, these behemoth breweries kind of started to get bigger and bigger and quickly started to dominate. And going from 3,000 breweries started to dwindle. And a lot of the mom and pop shops kind of started to close their doors and die out. Prohibition was the nail in the coffin. unfortunately. Even after Prohibition ended, it kind of became pretty clear that this once thriving, small, artisanal, local beer culture that we had been officially replaced by a homogenized national one. And for years we just kind of accepted it. It was the fizzy light lagers, it was refreshment over flavor, it was these ice cold served out of a bottle by large corporations, and that kind of was what we had for a really long time, and I'm sure people drinking beer in Japan for the last few decades can relate. But in 1978, this is very important because something changed for us, and we signed a law. President Jimmy Carter signed a law that legalized homebrewing, and also actually reopened the market to small brewers. And it might not have seemed like such a huge deal at the time, but what it did was really spark interest and encourage people to start trying things at home and start brewing their own beer and experimenting. And from there, a man named Charlie Papazian, or here we go with my first slide. Hey, Charlie Papazian founded the American Homebrewers Association and the Association of Brewers, which quickly became the Brewers Association that we have today. And that was really great for bringing together like-minded people, allowing people to share ideas and recipes and kind of bounce things off of each other. And because also ended up growing our industry and our talent from the ground up. And because homebrewing was already legal in England, it was a lot of our early American recipes were English styles. So you'll see pale ales, porters, and a lot of the early craft recipes, Anchor Porter, Sierra Pale, are English styles adapted to our own agriculture. And I wanted to bring that up because legislation is very important when you're starting or trying to grow an industry. And something kind of similar happened in Japan in 1994 when there was a loosening of these very strict beer laws that regulated things like production minimums. And it really kept small breweries almost extinct. I mean, it was almost, I want to say almost, it was pretty impossible for a small brewery to exist up until 1994. But when that law changed, all of a sudden, seemingly overnight, you had all of these craft small breweries start opening their doors and became pretty ubiquitous pretty quickly. But the problem was, a lot of people thought this is going to be it, this is going to be the time that kicks off this great industry. But unfortunately, it didn't happen. A lot of these beers were very overpriced. The quality was, kind of lacking. And a solid chunk of them ended up over the couple of years closing their doors. So the idea of this craft explosion kind of got delayed a little bit. And looking back, I think there are some key components that were missing, that a lot of people, will say were missing, that held back this explosion. It was brand new. There's no homebrewing in Japan, unfortunately, and they didn't have a pool of talent to pull from in Japan, so they relied very heavily on outside influence. Move this back. Outside talent. And the majority of these breweries, like I said, the quality was lacking, and the average person didn't want to pay 2-3 times what they were paying for a beer that wasn't much better than what they were used to. And lastly, with a handful of very important exceptions, there really wasn't anything distinctly Japanese about these beers. It wasn't something that people were really rallying behind and becoming proud of. And it became kind of dangerously close to Japanese craft beer being just something that's a overpriced, heavily marketed beer for tourists. And, we say that as far as it not being distinctly Japanese. On the opposite end, we had the US craft beer boom starting. And what really kicked it off for us was the fact that we were finally using American ingredients, distinctly American ingredients, most notably American hops. Put us on the map. You started seeing beers like Sierra Nevada Pale Ale, like Anchor Liberty, Lagunitas IPA come up. And for years, American hops were considered undrinkable, too aggressive, too assertive, too in your face. And, ironically, that's those same qualities were what made people fall in love with it. And I think it's really that kind of distinctly American combination of flavorful ingredients and a sensibility that's really breaking the rules, in your face, kind of a renegade and challenging the status quo, pushing flavor to the limits that got people really excited about our styles. And then creativity was limitless. So you had IPAs, you had imperial IPAs and triple IPAs and bourbon barrel-aged stouts and, all of these crazy things in between that are now being copied and sold around the world. So it worked for us, and initially, what seemed like disadvantages for us, losing our beer culture, having no real deep brewing roots or history, or structure, the way Belgium or Germany might have, ended up being some of our biggest advantages because, it allowed us to sort of borrow and hone and recreate styles in our own way with nothing but imagination and creativity. And it worked. It started working, and it happened in the US, and it's starting to happen all over the world. I think there's a lot of really exciting places that have great unique ingredients, strong culinary roots, distinct cultural identities that are taking those learned techniques and those brewing skills and then applying it and putting their own distinct spin on them. So one thing that I did want to mention is Italy. We'll take them for example. So Italy, obviously, far more famous for their wine than their beer. It makes me laugh a little that one of the most famous beers in Italy and popular beers is Peroni, which is owned by Asahi. And, it's an American style of beer that was inspired by a German one that is owned by a Japanese company with an Italian name, I think. Peroni, is it a name? Is it a word? But, and it's refreshing, and people might like it, and that's great. But to me, it by no means even begins to represent this rich culinary identity that Italy's famous for. So, what's exciting now is that we're seeing all of these small artisanal breweries not shy away from their own traditions and try to copy someone else's, but really incorporate those and bring in techniques like winemaking techniques and wine musts and grapes found only in specific regions, ingredients like chestnuts and grains and spices. It runs the gamut. And they're really creating beers that are distinctly Italian. Not only is it the agriculture, it's the sensibility, that cultural sensibility that really centers around the meal. And I think if you look, a lot of just the Italian bottles, they're beautiful, right? There's, oh, hello. Oh. So they're beautiful, the bottle shape, the labels. These are clearly meant to be proud of and shown off and displayed on the dinner table. Food compatibility is a key factor with just about anything in Italy. There's, brewers think about the way that beers are going to pair with certain dishes. It's the glass, it's the ritual, it's the hospitality, the enjoyment of it all. And I think when you're able to reflect that entirety in a beer, I'll not only seek it out, but I'll pay top dollar for it. I do, because it's well worth it. It's handcrafted, intentional, and delicious. Also, a country like Brazil. Brazil's a great, another country starting to come into their own with this just wealth of native ingredients. Things like caju fruit, guava, gabiroba, Brazilian coffee, cacao. There's so much, it's so rich. And not only the wood, they have all this unique wood. This is spicy, I hope I pronounce this right, but Amburana wood. The brewers are creating barrels to age their beer in that adds all these additional layers of complexity and flavor, which is just fabulous. And you can't find it anywhere else. I think it's exciting to see. Now, obviously, these are small batch beers, still a minute percentage of what's actually being sold, but everybody starts somewhere. And I think if you're looking to the future of what craft beer is going to be around the world, you're really going to start to see more of these distinct styles coming, these distinct regional styles emerging. And it's so exciting. It's already happening. A few years back, I was at a very large industry tasting, maybe over 100 brewers from the US and from around the world. And I kind of started to feel a little bad because I was like, maybe I'm just too jaded. I'm walking around, I'm tasting everything, and I've been doing this a while, and I'm like, it's good, Try my new IPA. It's an IPA, great, awesome, And I thought maybe I need to take a break. And then I found a beer that literally stopped me dead in my tracks. I remember it. I took pictures of it. I wouldn't shut up about it. And it was from Japan. And it was from the Hitachino brewery, or the Kyuchi brewery. It was a brand new series, and I loved them. They were one of the earliest breweries in Japan to really showcase the terroir of Japan in their beers. And it was their traditional red rice ale, which is brewed with polished red rice and fermented with sake and ale yeast, but aged in sakura barrels. So it was aged in the Japanese cherry blossom wood barrels. And it was just, my God, it was elegant, It was complex, it was balanced, and so well made. And it really stood out amongst hundreds of beers and hundreds of extreme beers, very flavorful beers. This stood out. And I think what's so cool about it is that it could not come from anywhere else in the world. There's nowhere else in the world that this beer could have come from, with that rice, with that barrel, with that wood, nothing. And so that inspiring that sensibility, I think, is certainly going to help Japanese craft beer stand out in a market this competitive. Because it is very competitive. It's very, very saturated. There are so many things. Just the sheer volume of beers on the market can be difficult for anyone, for brewers and drinkers. For brewers, you have to find your footing. You have to figure out how you're going to stand out and how you're able to make a splash in the market. But for drinkers, so many options can be intimidating and can be a little bit confusing. And I actually liken how I think about beer to new audiences is how I feel about sake. I was just talking about this. I love it. I'm interested, but I don't know anything. And so if you kind of go into a store and all you see is labels and you see someone standing there like, can I help you? It's like, no, I'm going to leave. It's overwhelming. And so I think there's a way, brewers are constantly trying to find new ways to communicate their message and reach new customers. And a really important way to do that we're seeing now more than ever, which is excellent, is education. Oops, okay, well, looks like I don't know how to do it. Hey, education. Because, craft beer really has grown so much, and it's grown so much, but it's still a really small percentage of what's being sold. And so, I think small breweries that really can't compete on a global scale, at least with the marketing budgets or the might of some of these big conglomerates, need to educate their consumers. They need to do it a slower way to get people to know about them. A lot of times one-on-one, face-to-face. They take their time. And they do that in several different ways. So tap rooms. You've probably been to one of your favorite breweries' tap rooms, right? You can go in, ask questions. They have a friendly staff. They get to build direct relationships with their customers as opposed to selling to a bar or a grocery store where they never get to interact. Friendly staff, they can make recommendations. They get to feel like a part of the culture. A lot of breweries and tasting rooms offer flights. I offer them at all my bars. It's a great way to try a lot of different things without feeling like you need to commit. And it's so weird. Sometimes it's just funny how people just are a little bit unsure to even try something new. And it always kind of surprises me. I'll have beer nights and reps will have free samples and walk around, would you like to try a beer? And maybe it's a New York thing, but they're like, what is that? So, obviously having small pours where you can kind of explore and try things is a really great way to help open people's minds a little bit. Also, breweries nowadays have a lot of what's called dedicated brand reps. So we have the 3-tier system in the United States. So a brewery, unless it's now the small breweries occasionally have loopholes, but you sell to a distributor. So you're not actually buying beer from a brewery, you're buying it from a distributor. And so they'll hire brand reps to come in as the face of their brand. And they go in and build relationships with buyers and beverage directors. They do really exciting events like, Meet the Brewer or tap takeovers and beer dinners and pairings and classes. I think events like this are excellent. Participating in something like this, great way to reach new audiences. It's how I got started, just going to little tastings and being like, what's that? And festivals. I keep wondering when the festivals are going to be played. They're great. They keep getting bigger. They keep becoming, there's more and more and more festivals all over the world. And I think that it's obvious. You get to try a lot of beer. Price of one ticket. You're meeting people. You're meeting the brewers. You're asking questions. All that jazz. But it's fun, and people enjoy it. It's social. It's a thing to do. It's a way to meet people. It's a way to enjoy what you're doing. You're not downloading it on your phone. You're not. You have to have it in real life. And I think it's not always just about what's in the glass. Sometimes it's a little bit more than that, and that kind of goes into people. There are also people that drink craft because they want to support a small business. They don't want to, spend their money with a large corporation, and they, it's really important to them. So now that's even becoming a little bit difficult. There's been several acquisitions in the last few years. There's venture capital. There's, the big guys like Anheuser-Busch buying up craft. There's all these things going on that it's just an added level of confusion. So a lot of craft breweries wanted to kind of figure out a way to communicate to customers who they are and who's still independent, who's still craft. And so the Brewers Association recently came up with this little seal. And if you haven't seen it yet on bottles, next time you're in the store, look for it. I'm sure you'll be like, oh, now that you see it, you'll see it everywhere, or on bars, on stickers, on windows. But this is just kind of their way to say, we're still independent, we're still craft, and it's just helpful to sort of navigate the beer aisle if you're starting from scratch. I think that's great. So education. So along the lines of education and new audiences, another thing we're seeing nowadays that, of course, I couldn't be more grateful for, and I'm really, really excited to see, is inclusivity, more inclusivity in beer. It brings me to something else. I think a lot of women, you hear that all the time, women don't drink beer, and I get this all the time. Do you actually drink beer? I'm like, oh my God. No. But it's like, hello. But I understand it's that perception, because for so long, we were able to deal with things like this. This frustrating messaging for decades, and bikini-clad advertisements, labels. Now these are mild, you guys. I picked the mild ones. I didn't want to offend anyone, but labels and names, they're just so ridiculous. And when you partner that with the idea that the majority of these beers are bland and not that exciting, so you have kind of a mediocre product paired with this ridiculous messaging, it's understandable that people would feel alienated. And you're not really seeing craft beer commercials. You're not really seeing a lot of people go out and talk about it that often. So, it's now there's huge chunks of the population that were for a really long time have been left out of the conversation are now coming back. And I think even with craft, for so long it was that who's the typical craft drinker is, maybe white guy in his 30s with a beard and a flannel, and it's still that perception, and that's cool. Listen, it's not wrong. I work in beer. It's not wrong. But it's I don't think that was intentional or meant to be exclusionary or anything like that from the part of the craft breweries. I just think it was a little insular for a while, kind of like if you know, you know, and if you don't, you don't, and that was kind of the end of it. And so now you have all these people coming to the table that are really excited, that are doing all kinds of cool things. We have brewers, we have chemists starting beer festivals, meetup groups and tasting groups and Cicerone study groups and all kinds of things that are going on now that are so exciting. And these are great messages. And so I have spent a lot of time trying to help get this message out too, because when I first started in beer, I couldn't believe all these flavors and styles existed, and no one told me. And I was in New York, and I'm going to restaurants, and I'm in this world, and so if I don't know about it, I can only imagine someone who, isn't necessarily seeking out these flavors would just not know they exist, but they're so diverse and so exciting. So I kind of spent a lot of time, I started to get more into media and more trying to talk about it to new audiences. And if you see the publications, none of these are really beer-centric. These are people that are reading these are not necessarily the beer drinker. But in my mind, I'm hoping maybe they will be. And then it's easier for me to sell the geeky beers at my bars. It's not such a hard sell. No. But really, it is just about, I think if people know it's there, they'll appreciate it. And you keep hearing everyone, oh, the craft beer bubble's going to burst, and it's not going to grow, and how can it keep growing? Well, I have an idea. But all the people that have not been drinking it because they didn't know about it are going to discover it, and they're going to like it. So it's just about getting that correct messaging out. And it's not just traditional media. New media, social media, there are thousands of Facebook groups dedicated to craft beer. There's Instagram influencers and podcasts and beer magazines and all kinds of fun things with just people really working to get what they love out to the world. All right, so industry as big as it is, all these trends coming and going, but what's happening now? Because we've seen so many. And I'm sure this is something, if any of you, if you're in New York and you're kind of seeing it, this is a big one. It's not necessarily something I think imports should be scared of. I think it's a tricky one, though, because oftentimes it really does come from a good place. It comes from a place of people wanting to support their community, to support, local and people that you respect. But what is the definition of local? I think sometimes that gets a little cloudy, because are we talking about local business or local agriculture? If a beer is brewed in Brooklyn with hops from New Zealand and malts from Germany and yeast from White Labs in California, do we consider that a local product? perhaps, depending on your point of view, maybe. You're definitely supporting local business, which is great, but not necessarily a local farmer. And so, I do think that there is a ton of incredible reasons to support local, but I do think if you ask 20 different people why it's important to them, you'll probably get 20 different answers. And, what I do hear a lot is that it sometimes can be more about supporting a local business or a local farmer or people you believe in as opposed to a big corporation. And when that's the case, I think a beer from Japan, for example, brewed with native yuzu, from a family-owned brewery that grow their own hops, might fit in just the same, might make just as much sense at a local-centric account as a beer that was simply kind of assembled in that city. So, it's all, I guess, about point of view. But I just would say don't necessarily count it out. If something's local and you're not local and you're a brewer, there's ways around it. If you have a good story to tell, I think people are often interested. Collaborations. I love this. I love the collaborations because it's great. It's community, people coming together to, try new things, to learn from each other, to support each other. I'm a huge fan, and I think it's also often an opportunity to use new ingredients for the first time. With a lot of the collaborations we're seeing now, we're seeing a lot of collaborations of American breweries with foreign, in Europe or in South America, and incorporating ingredients from the collaborating brewery into the beer. A while back, there's a brewery, okay, I'm gonna say this name. A great example, a Japanese brewer, Toshiyuki Ishii, began working at Stone Brewing in California, and he wanted to really kind of hone his skills with West Coast style beers and with cask conditioned ales. So he did a great stint at Stone, came back to Japan, became brewery director of Yoho Brewing Company, and eventually founded Ishii Brewing Company, and introduced cask ales to Japan, which is really, really cool. But in 2011, after the devastating earthquake and tsunami, he wanted to do something to help and decided to call his friends at Stone, his former colleagues, call up some friends at Baird, who's actually pouring beers here tonight, also in Japan, and create this really exciting collaboration, and it's a Japanese green tea IPA. It was fabulous, it was delicious, but it also was great because it raised money for a great cause. It showed this amazing, beer community where people support each other and have each other's back, but it also showcased, and promoted the uniqueness of Japanese ingredients. And when we started seeing things like this happen, it was kind of, oh, look at that, they're doing a collaboration. Oh, it was like a little bit, I wouldn't say rare, but now, every time I open my Instagram page, it's this, friends, we're here, we're hanging, and it's just constant, and I just think that's really exciting. So we're definitely seeing a lot more people working together. Ironically, at the same time, it's starting to get more competitive and a little bit more cutthroat, so we'll see who wins. Okay, rarity, scarcity, drop culture. Drop culture, meaning like the idea of the super small batch, very limited quality, limited quantity, quality. Hopefully it's good quality, sometimes it isn't. But the drop culture, or with these highly publicized drop dates or release dates that kind of create this vibe and energy of scarcity, encourage the social media bragging, I got the whale, it's like a white whale, and I got it. And quite notably, lines around the block. And this happens a lot. And it can be a good thing or a bad thing. I think depending on your business model, if you want to take this as something great, because on one hand it is, you have people lining up for your beer, that's good. It creates a lot of buzz and helps, get these die-hard loyal fans. But on the other hand, it can sometimes, position your beer in a place where it feels out of reach, or like potential to alienate people. They think, it's too much, I don't want to wait in line, just give me a normal beer, and they just kind of don't think about it. Or the inevitable, there's always one, it's not even that good. Why would people wait in line response, which happens a lot, even if they've never tried it. So there's, it kind of goes both ways, but you're seeing this constantly. Every day. I'm going to the can release, and I think it's kind of cool. A lot of times they'll bring beers, it's more of a social gathering. Like, I used to wait in line for Yankee tickets and concert. I get it, and it's kind of a fun thing to do, but it's also tough because it creates the secondary market, and you're seeing a lot of these beers go to the black market. Yes, there's a black market for beer, but get sold or get traded, and then, especially with the really hoppy, like the IPAs we're going to talk about in a second, they get traded all over the world, and they're probably drank in less than pristine condition, or they went to somebody's car and then went across in the FedEx and blah blah blah. So, is it great for the beer? Sometimes, maybe not. Meh. But when the hype is warranted, and when there is something that is just like this because it's so good and people love it and they want it, it's nice to see that people will wait for this. I mean, we were talking earlier. There's a little Japanese restaurant in Miami, to go in to speak about whiskey, that has this great little speakeasy in the back, and they do these tastings of Japanese whiskey, super rare, delicious Japanese whiskey that book out months in advance. And so I think if you put quality first and you get people excited, they will wait for it, and they will pay for it, and they will talk about it. So it's kind of cool. If you're starting off as a brewer and you want to make something outrageous, there's a market for it. Okay, new takes on our classic IPAs. So IPA was what really put us on the map, and now you're seeing every variation from here to next Tuesday on that classic IPA. This is everywhere. If any of you have been to a beer bar in the last, I don't even know how long, there's probably at least one, if not more, hazy IPAs. And what that means is the New England style IPA, hazy IPA, loaded with late addition flavor and aroma hops. So you get very little bitterness. It's more of the, tropical, very cloudy, often referred to as juicy or juice bombs. They've actually stayed on the scene a little bit, I think, longer than people initially expected. And you never know what's going to be a trend and what's going to stick around. And they've been on the scene for a while, and people love them. They're super popular. They're a little pricey because they're loaded with hops. And I think a lot of people who were terrified of IPAs or really hated IPAs because of that bitterness are now finding themselves loving these juice bombs and these tropical flavors that come from these hazy IPAs. But I'm starting to also see a little, all right, I'm over this. Give me bitter back. So we'll see. I guess it's to be determined how long it's going to stick around. Milkshake IPAs as well, which you take the hazy IPA, add in some lactose, milk sugar for some sweetness, different fruits. You could see peach or raspberry, pineapple, and oftentimes spices like vanilla bean, cinnamon, things of that nature. So they call it an IPA, but there's very, very little hop character actually comes through. It's often more like a cocktail. And so I like them because, it's a great way to convert people who don't think they like beer. If you ask, what do you drink normally? Well, I like, a mimosa, or I like a screwdriver, or whatever, a fruity cocktail. Perfect. And so they are popular with the beer world, but also outside of the beer world. And I think that's why they're kind of becoming a little bit more prevalent still. Brut IPA, as in Brut champagne, inspired by champagne, fermented bone dry, crystal clear, effervescent, sparkling. I think brewers right now are kind of going into that, like putting the foot in the hot tub. Like, we're going to try it, we're going to see, because they're coming out kind of sporadically, but they haven't stopped yet. And there have been some really good ones. And with that dryness, when it's so dry, it ends up being great food partners. And so I think there's a whole element of restaurants and high-end fine dining places that could do really well with something like this if they can get over the can. That's often, cans are great. They're better for beer, honestly. Keep it fresh, they keep it out of light, but it's still the physical, a can at a fine dining table sometimes is a little off-putting, but I think flavor-wise, fits right in. And in session, I was hesitant to put this on any kind of trend, but it's still, people I think thought that it was going to be a trend, and it's still sticking around, and I think for good reason. If you have IPAs that everyone loves, and it's still the highest selling craft beer category in the world, well, in the US for sure, then why not have a session IPA, meaning a lower alcohol version? So all of that hop character, lower alcohol, so you can drink it when you're tailgating, or you're at a celebration or some party where you're drinking all day. But lower alcohol version of IPA. So those are still sticking around, and I think that I really don't see them going anywhere anytime soon. And we talked a little bit about the Green Tea IPA. I know in our tasting today there's going to be a Matcha IPA. I think if we can do just to see a handful of the variations that we're already doing, think about the possibilities of what can be done. If you go around the world and you kind of see, like the Matcha IPA is a great example, or Yuzu IPA, things that are kind of coming out with these ingredients, I think are really exciting, and I can't wait to see what people are going to do. Inspiration from outside the beer world. Cocktail-inspired beers, wine hybrids, we talked a little about that, and the Italian breweries are doing. Cider blends, this is a beer that's inspired by a Manhattan or an old-fashioned. gin and tonic goza. I think inspiration can kind of come from anywhere, and using language, non-beer language, is really helpful when you're talking to someone who doesn't think they like beer or don't like beer. And I have at one of my locations of Treadwell Park uptown, I have a reserve list, a vintage reserve list that has all of these different vintage dated, very rare and expensive but delicious beers. But I didn't want to put this out of reach and just have a bunch of unpronounceable names with high price tags. So I wrote a page about all of them and made it really easy to understand language, a lot of the language borrowed from wine, and made comparisons with cocktails and comparisons with spirits, so that even if you weren't a beer drinker, you could still recognize it and understand kind of a little bit about the flavor that you're going to be getting. And these do really well at the bars. Rosé sour, I mean, people see the word rosé, they lose their minds. So that's something that's pretty cool, pretty helpful. And I think, last year at this exact event, Josh Bernstein spoke about sake, and he spoke about how, brewers in America are starting to apply the elements of sake production to their brewing and the brewing process. So I think inspiration comes from anywhere, but we're seeing a lot of it right now from other parts of the beverage world. It's kind of cool. This is funny. So the style that craft beer initially began to get rid of, that craft started out rejecting, that light beer, is now coming back with a vengeance. But it's really good breweries that are making their own sort of low-calorie, easy-drinking, light beers. They're affordable, they're crushable. But what's different about these is that a lot of them aren't brewed with any adjuncts. So you're really getting this, you're not really sacrificing flavor. You're still getting, all malt, you're still getting great aromas. It's just light and easy to drink. And plus there's the factor, you're supporting a craft brewery instead of a corporate one. And I think that's, if you're kind of between the two, why not go for something from a brewer that you know or that you respect, or a small business? And voila, classic styles, quality over hype. I'm happy about this. Because, just because there are so many options out there, and there are, it doesn't mean that they're all good. And I think with everyone trying to stand out and trying to make a name for themselves, you're seeing so many splashy, crazy things just coming at all times. And, the trendy beers, the new ones, etc. And it can be enough to give anybody palate fatigue. I said that at the thing, I'm like, I'm over it. And that can happen. And so what ends up happening when all of those are going on is people end up going back to their tried and true. Things like Pilsners and Kolsch and Vienna lagers. And so now we're seeing a lot of new breweries, places like Jack's Abbey, come in and create these just classic styles really well. They choose to show off their talent and their brewing skills as opposed to their crazy imagination, and making it really accessible for people. And with that, you're also seeing the return of classic beers, really, really delicious, like Sierra Nevada Pale Ale and Bell's Two Hearted, come back to super geeky beer lists. Because for a while it was like, oh, Sierra, that's so passé. And it's like, no, they're, have been doing this consistently for a really long time. They've been so influential. And so I think now it's kind of coming back to that, where you're like, oh, yeah, this is a really delicious beer. And I don't think people should be punished for being successful. If they're doing something right, it's for a reason, and it's working. So, seeing classic styles, seeing Pilsners really well made, seeing people dedicate time into doing something right, just kind of proves that great things do stand the test of time. And I think that when you're coming from the right place, and quality and consistency and passion and all of this is never going to go out of style. So that makes me really excited. And on that note, I feel like I've been talking a lot. So I'm going to start to think about that tasting and how excited I am about it. But thank you all so much for listening, and I'm really just thrilled that we got to chat about this.
Anne, thank you so much. That was fantastic. I really, really appreciated that. It was a very unique perspective. And, you're absolutely right. When I picture a beer specialist, one of your slides had the guy in the flannel shirt with the big black beard and the baseball cap. That's what I picture as, a beer specialist. So,
and there's plenty of those.
There's plenty.
It's just that it's more diverse than I think people realize.
So I'm sure people are curious, how did you get into beer? We didn't get much of your background. So how did you get into your role as a beer expert?
Tasting.
Tasting.
I like to call it tasting, not drinking. It sounds better. Tasting. And I think I fell in love with Belgian beers first. I think Chimay and Duvel and Delirium, I thought, oh my gosh, they were so flavorful, and it was the whole presentation, the glassware, the strength. I was 21. I was 21. I was 21, but really, when you're young and you have a budget, and all of a sudden I was finding that this exquisite beer that was just some of the best I'd ever had is the same price as, honestly, like a Yellowtail bottle. And it's like, okay, well, this is a much more fun hobby to get into. The people are really cool. The flavors are amazing. And so I just kind of was playing with it and was a hobby. And then when I came back, I kind of quit life. I was in marketing for a while and ended up just road tripping in an RV cross country and left everything and drank my local beers along the way. So when I got back to New York, I thought, well, if I could work in a bar for 3 months in a beer bar and just learn, then I'll go back to a real job. That was like
never happened.
11 years ago.
The rest is history.
Yeah, that wasn't. Because there was, like I said, there was so much that I discovered, and I thought, well, how in the world is this being hidden from me?
Yeah.
Like, people need to know about this. That's why the whole media thing started, because, no one knows that who knows about a Berliner Weiss or a Hefeweizen if you're not actively seeking it out?
Yeah.
But I go to my family and my aunts, and who are, in her 60s, and she's like, what is this Flemish red? It's amazing, and it's like, yeah, you would like it if you got to know about it. So.
That's really true. I mean, people ask me how I discovered sake, and it was 15 years ago at a sushi restaurant. I had my first premium sake, and I was like, nobody told me this was out there. Like, this is amazing. Yeah. And it really changed my life. It sounds like you had a similar experience.
Absolutely. And then once you start to see the people and you start to meet who's behind it, and going cross country and seeing how proud people were of their local brewery. It was almost like, the alma mater, your baseball team. It's like, you have to try this from, Big Sky Brewing in Montana. We're drinking Moose Drool in Yellowstone. And it's like everyone wants to talk about it and share. And you see how it's affecting small communities. You see how it's reinvigorating towns. It's supporting agriculture. It's like there are so many pros that the beer being so delicious is almost like a bonus at this point, because there's just so many positives. So, and you get to drink, and it's fun, and people are welcoming a little bit more than some of the other industries maybe would be.
Absolutely. So you talked about tasting being integral to your growth in the beer industry and discovering beer. We're all about to enjoy tasting of some fantastic craft beers. For us who don't have a lot of experience, what should we do? How should we taste beer? What should we look for? And what do you recommend for someone who's just getting started tasting beer? How to approach it?
Well, I typically would say, don't be afraid to try new things. Now, this might be a little different here when a lot of the labels are in Japanese, but typically, like if you're in a beer festival, for example, when you're tasting things, if you find something that you really like, I just recommend take a picture of the label, write it down, when you have that, and kind of take pictures of all the things that you like. And then what you can do when you go to a bar or a beer bar or someone that's knowledgeable is say, these are what I like, why? And if someone shows me a handful of beer styles that they really like, there's typically threads. And if there aren't, then great, you like beer, But if there's certain things you're like, oh, I like this Belgian triple and this Hefeweizen and this, you start to think maybe it's that spicy yeast, and this is what you could ask for, and this is the vocabulary that'll help you. So just remembering what you liked is helpful. If there's someone there that knows if there's a representative of the brewery that can actually tell you about it, that sometimes at the beer festivals and things they have volunteers that are there for free tickets, not necessarily the same, but ask questions, and don't be afraid to sound dumb. Yeah. If anyone makes you feel like feel that way for asking a question, then they're in the wrong position. This is hospitality. This is sharing. This is not something you should walk into a beer bar and say, well, what do you like? And you're like, I don't know. And then they're like, that should not happen. And it happens. It happens a lot, and it breaks my heart. I'm like, come on, you guys. We're trying to welcome people in, not scare people off. Yeah. So don't be afraid to ask questions, and Untapped is a good resource. Yeah. Checking things in, if you have the Untapped app, and you check in, you rate things, so you can kind of keep track of what you've tried and what you liked. That's good.
Awesome. So let's talk a little bit about the Japanese side of craft beer. I think a lot of people may not know that home brewing is basically illegal in Japan. And it's the law is if you brew a beer that's 1% alcohol or less, you can make it at home. Otherwise, you need a brewing license.
For the baby bottle, come on.
Yeah.
1% beer.
So that's been a huge challenge, because my understanding is that the home brewing culture in the U.S. really was the starting point.
Absolutely.
For the growth.
I mean, that's how can you, I think there's still production minimums for brewing license, right?
Yes.
Right. So, but you can't homebrew, right? So how do you get that practice? And I think what's happening now, which, I'm fine with is like a lot of really talented craft brewers in Japan are coming to the US and going to places Belgium and Germany to hone their skills and kind of learn the business and then go back when they're confident enough in starting their own breweries, or they start with sake breweries and then expand into beer and start, people who kind of have that sensibility and understand the brewing processes can do it. But yeah, I mean, that's such an important part, at least for here. Maybe it's different, but you can play, you can try things on a small scale, you can see if it works. I mean, there's combinations of beers that in theory should never work. And you're like, what did you make that with? What? Like butterfly, pea flower with this and this, and you're saying all these things, you're like, I don't know, man. Even those milkshake IPAs, some of those combinations, you're like, really? And then you try them and they're great, and you wouldn't really be able, you don't want to try something like that on such a huge scale where you have to then dump it if it doesn't work. You got to play. So maybe that'll change.
Yeah, it's a big challenge. Right now, I think there's around 300 craft breweries in Japan. Compared to the West, that's still a really small number, right?
Yes, I mean, we have a lot of people, but it's all about, again, going back to what you consider craft. Is it craft because of the production numbers? Is it craft because it's independent? Is it craft because it's handcrafted and the ingredients are really high quality? We have definitions set by the Brewers Association that outline what craft is, but they're not the same all over the world. So you'll see a lot of times, even in the US, people don't know what it means. They think if it's a normal, funny label, then it's craft. And I'm embarrassed to say this, but I was in a liquor store and they had vote for your best craft, and they had all these things. And I'm not usually this person, but I looked at it and I just wrote not craft, not craft, not craft, and put it in the ballot box. And, I was like, it's not. And that's why something, what is the definition? So I think I'm excited just to see creativity grow. I'm excited to see what flavors are going to come out of different places and what they're going to come up with. I mean, there's so much creativity, no limits.
Yeah, maybe we can talk a little bit about, I really liked in your presentation, you talked about ingredients and how being true to your local home base is really the key to success, I think, in a lot of ways. So what are, in some of the Japanese beers that you're familiar with, what are some of the ingredients that we can look for that are true to Japan? I mean,
I've had beers with, there's yuzu and sancho pepper and soba. I had a beer with bonito flakes.
Oh, wow.
It wasn't dancing, but it was a little savory, and it was it's really great, kind of rich umami kind of savoriness that was added to it. I saw that we have a beer in there that is with an oyster stout with local Japanese oysters. I love that style.
Wait, there's oysters in there?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, if you have oysters, you have stout. It's a great combo. Why not just put them together? And it gives this, try it. It's good. No, it is. There's a really good style. I love it. I mean, you see that a lot, but it's adds that little salinity and a little bit of, again, that.
And umami, I'm sure.
Absolutely, yeah.
That's the cornerstone of Japanese cuisine, is that dashi broth, soy sauce, miso, that umami flavor. So it would make sense that there's some craft beers that pick up on that trait of umami in there.
Absolutely. And it's not just necessarily about the ingredients. I don't think everyone needs to go out and find some crazy unique ingredients to make a good beer. I think with Japan in particular, it's also that cultural sensibility of really the respect for craftsmanship, right? The respect for doing something right, for owning your craft, and I think taking outside inspiration, adjusting it for their own, your own cultural needs and sort of what it is that you're looking for, and then perfecting it. And having that really focus on making something delicious, and whether it's just cultivating your own yeast. The brewery Hitachino ended up working with the Department of Agriculture to how do you say it? It was a malt from Japan that had gone
Reestablished?
Regrew, I guess. They found it from, they got the seeds from the Department of Agriculture and regrew this Kaneko Golden Malt. And it's just a really lovely, bready flavor. It's not anything crazy. It made a really good lager, and it was awesome. So I don't think you have to find these crazy ingredients in order to give a sense of place. I think it could be cultural. I think it could be attention to detail, or fun ingredient like yuzu. We have a yuzu white in there too, so I'm excited. I've been looking at this list. I'm excited. Excited to try it.
I think those really unique, strange ingredients can be a good conversation starter and get people interested. One of the things I think that is important to grow interest, whether it's sake or craft beer, is just to have people think about it. It's so easy to just turn off your brain and say, I'll have an Asahi Super Dry or whatever, just like the whatever is there on the menu, versus taking a moment to think about the craft beer list, right?
Absolutely, and taking a moment to enjoy and be present with what you're drinking. And it's so funny, like, there's that whole drink from a bottle, drink from a bottle. Well, bust this up a little bit, because carbonation is a great masking agent to hide flavors, right? Cold temperatures are also a masking agent. So if you're drinking something ice cold, highly carbonated, beer makes me full. Well, let's see how we're drinking it. You're taking ice cold carbonated beverage. You're literally putting gas into your stomach. Where's it going to expand? Yeah, of course you feel full. You're drinking 6 ice cold beers in a row, right down the throat. Ta-da! I mean, yeah. And so taking the time to, pour it, notice the color, notice the aromas, enjoy it, savor it, and be present and know what you're eating, know what you're drinking, and enjoy. That's something that I think is also a really important element. Yeah. If you're a Cabernet drinker and you find this vintage Cabernet and somebody just puts it in like a pint glass, you're going to be like, what? Or right out of the bottle, it's not the same experience. Yeah. So I don't know. I think there's a lot of elements that kind of help create the enjoyment of beer.
So we've talked about some of those unique ingredients that Japanese beers can bring. How do you think, given your experience putting together beer menus, where can Japanese beer fit on a menu, or what type of ingredients can they bring to an overall menu? And I also wanted to talk a little bit about beer and food pairings too. Yeah. So when you're putting together a menu, what are you considering about food pairings?
So where it belongs in the menu for me, it's on the middle right corner of Japan, and that's where we have our Japan beers. But I really just think it's about figuring out. So it depends, if you're coming at it from a brewer's perspective, I like to say, look at the account, look at where you're going, and kind of think about it and personalize it. If it's a local place, like we were saying, maybe there's you have a story to tell that's amazing. If it's a fine dining, maybe you look at the menu and say, oh my God, I think this would pair incredibly well with this. I think every program is different and unique, so it's not, and every Japanese beer is different and unique, so it's not really easy to just be like, this is where it belongs. I think it's about making it personalized choice of how and why. But I think knowing why is important. Like, if you're going to put beer on a menu, for me, I know why I have every single keg, every bottle on there. I can tell you whether it's delicious, there's a great story, it's there's always something. And I think having a story to tell and having a purpose when you're going to try to get into these accounts would be really helpful.
Yeah. And what about the beer and food pairings? So what are some guidelines you could give us for if we're at home and we want to buy craft beer, bring it home? What type of things should we look for pairing food and beer?
So I typically there's obviously, to say that annoying answer, the first rule is there are no rules, but really, because it's about kind of experimentation. But I think, what is it that you want to play up? And I think that's kind of where I go first, is if I'm looking at, let's say I'm having a roast chicken with, different herbs. Okay, well, I love these herbs. These fresh herbs are really great. So maybe what's something that's going to go really nicely with the rosemary or this? And then the aromatics of what we're eating. And then I'm like, okay, well, this beer has a really great expressive yeast that has a lot of those same characteristics, the nutmeg, the cardamom, blah, 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 and they end up going really nicely together. Hop bitterness is great for heavy foods, for fried foods, things like that. If you have this oils and cheeses and things that have oils that coat your tongue, hops can be really great for kind of scrubbing out those oils and refreshing your palate. Same with acidity. So if anyone's had sour beers or these big, bold, kind of funky, acidic beers are also really great for that. A Flemish red, for example, like a big, bold, kind of sweet and sour style beer is amazing with Chinese food. It's amazing with funky blue cheeses, things that are really difficult to pair with wine, because that acidity can kind of come in and balance everything and make it go really nicely. And carbonation. That's one thing beer has going for it that wine doesn't. And I love wine. I'm not knocking wine, but I think that carbonation is really, really helpful for beer pairings because it is like every time you take a sip, you get a little palate refresher.
Yeah, scrubbing bubbles, right? They really cleanse your palate.
Yeah. It's like why champagne works so well. And the whole beer and, wine and cheese pairing, it's like, I've definitely had some amazing wine and cheese pairings for sure, but as an overall, just if you were to start from scratch, beer pairs far better with cheese, in my opinion, than wine does. I think it's more of a social thing. The wine and cheese party is kind of where that took off. But if you're looking flavor-wise, beer is a product, right? It's an agriculture, but it has all of these great flavors from the hops, from herbal to floral to grapefruit. You have malt flavors that range from toast and bread and cracker to fig and chocolate and coffee. And then yeast, expressive yeast can give you banana, can give you clove, can give you cinnamon.
Wow.
And all of these different flavors are nothing you haven't heard before. I mean, they're food descriptors.
Mm-hmm.
So I think people that are looking for beer always think, well, I have to have this whole new vocabulary. No, you don't. You can walk into a bar and say, hey, I'm making, or, I really, really like gin and tonic. What do you recommend as a beer? Or I love rosé. What do you like? And I think if you just start asking questions based on flavors and based on what you already know and don't worry about how it sounds, you'll be able to find a whole new group of styles to play with and cook with and pair with. And yeah.
Great. So last question, what do you think the future brings for the craft beer market here in the U.S. and abroad? Do you see any trends coming up or any new developments in the craft beer market that we should look out for in the next 5, 10, 20 years?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we were saying is about seeing those regional styles, seeing people kind of come up and have, I don't think it's just going to be Belgium, Germany, England, US. I think it's going to be Japan. I think it's going to be Brazil. I think it's going to be Chile. I was just in Chile speaking at the Craft Brewers Conference, and they're just getting started. I mean, they're having trouble now getting ingredients, getting healthy yeast to, there's all these different elements, but the passion's there. And the excitement's there. And so I think you're going to start seeing all of these new brewing hubs pop up all over the world that are proud of what they do, that can, people will travel for. And that's exciting. At the same time, I think it's, I hate to say this, but I do see it getting a little more cutthroat. I think it's kind of one of the, you're seeing people already. There's a lot of that camaraderie that got people so excited in the beginning, the collabs, all that good stuff. Yeah. You're also seeing the opposite end. You're seeing people go in there and fighting for lines and shelf space. And so I think if you're going to get into this, it's great, but just know that you really have to want to.
What about apps and technology? Do you think things will continue to grow? You mentioned social media a little bit.
Yeah, I like social media, and it's fun, and I do Instagram and all this stuff. It's great, but I think, I don't know, it's like, I hate going into the bar and seeing 15 people just there. Like, it's a bar, talk.
Talk to each other.
Yeah, it's definitely helpful. Like, you can promote when you're releasing something. You can, communicate about events. You can stay in touch with people. I mean, there's a lot of positive aspects to that. And there's, apps like Untapped, like I said, that are great. Beermenus.com. You can request push notifications. So if there's something, like people always go nuts, like, where's Heady Topper? When are you getting Heady Topper? And, we do occasionally, we get it, but it just shows up. Like, they tell us when we get it, and we get it. So to put that on social media or on Untapped or things where if you were waiting for that beer, it pops up on your phone. It's like, hey, Treadwell has this. I think that's really cool. So I think you're seeing a lot more of like the communication aspect of it all. But I still hope that people will maybe talk to each other more and ask questions. You can ask your bartender about the beer. You don't have to look it up first, So I think it's a combination, a nice, healthy combination I would like to see.
The good news is that access is going to increase, and new access to beers from new places is going to increase. Sounds good all around.
Yeah.
Well, everyone's been very patient.
I know. So, we're all thirsty, right?
Thank you for bearing with us. We're going to take a break now, and we're going to move into the tasting room. We're going to have a wide variety of Japanese craft beers to taste. Anne will be available there to answer all your questions. And thank you all so much for coming tonight. We had a wonderful time. And we'll meet you in the tasting room. Thank you so much.
Thank you.